When Speaker Nancy Pelosi tried to publicly humiliate Denzel Washington during a fiery congressional hearing, she didn't expect his calm, devastating reply to leave the entire chamber in stunned silence. With just one sentence, Denzel flipped the script and left Pelosi speechless. The moment went viral instantly, igniting a storm of reactions across America. The chamber was unusually still. Cameras were rolling. The country was watching. Denzel Washington, recently appointed as Special Commissioner for Public Integrity, had just taken his seat to oversee a high-stakes hearing on federal accountability and infrastructure failures. But before he could even adjust his microphone, Speaker Pelosi stood up. With fire in her eyes, she slammed a heavy file onto the desk. "Mr. Washington," she snapped, "the American people deserve to know why you've remained silent about the mismanagement of recovery funds in Ohio. Or are you too loyal to the former administration to speak the truth?" Gasps swept across the chamber. Her voice echoed like a gunshot in a cathedral. Denzel didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked. But deep inside, something ancient stirred. Memories of being mocked as a poor kid from South Central, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs so they could survive. He had been dismissed his whole life. He glanced slowly around the room, then back at Pelosi. He knew what this was. She wanted a public takedown. But what she didn't know was that so did he, only this time it wouldn't be his blood on the floor. Pelosi pressed on, her voice rising with theatrical authority. "You said nothing when factories shut down," she pointed. "You were silent when rail spills poisoned families. Your allegiance to populism has blinded you to the real pain of real people." A few senators clapped. Reporters typed like mad. Social media began to flicker and blaze. But Denzel didn't move. He sat forward, folded his hands on the polished desk. No reaction. Yet his heart pounded, not from fear, but from memory. He remembered standing in the hospital corridors of East Palestine, holding the hand of a mother whose child had stopped breathing, hearing the silence in rooms where answers never came. And now he was being accused by someone who hadn't even shown up. The injustice, the hypocrisy, the buried rage. But he stayed still because he only needed one sentence. "Answer the question, Mr. Washington," Pelosi snapped. "Why do you sit silent while your people suffer?" Denzel finally stood. His voice came low, steady, like thunder hiding behind a mountain. He locked eyes with her and said, "Madam Speaker, where were you when mothers in East Palestine buried their children, while you were fundraising in Napa Valley wine cellars?" The silence that followed was brutal. A few senators dropped their pens. A reporter audibly gasped from the press gallery. Pelosi's face turned pale. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hands began to shake, because everyone in that chamber knew she hadn't gone. Not once, and Denzel had just carved the truth into the walls of Congress with one sentence, and that was just the beginning. The Senate chamber had never been so still. No coughs, no whispers, just a nation holding its breath. News anchors paused mid-sentence. Hashtags like #DenzelSpeaks and #East Palestine truth surged online. Some staffers quietly cried because they too remembered the families. Pelosi stood frozen. She fumbled with her notes, trying to regroup, but the words were gone. That sentence had struck her like a punch to the chest, because it wasn't political, it was real. Denzel didn't smirk. He simply looked away. He didn't gloat. Denzel simply lowered his eyes for a moment. You could almost feel the weight he carried, of mothers, of fathers, of forgotten towns. Then slowly he sat back down. The nation was watching a man who didn't defend himself with anger, but with pain, with truth. And now the Senate had no choice but to listen. As Nancy Pelosi stood frozen, the whispers among the senators grew louder. Did he just say that? She really didn't go? This changes everything. Majority Whip Garcia leaned over to Pelosi and whispered, "Nancy, you need to stop now." But she didn't move. Her pride was bleeding, but her ego wouldn't let her retreat. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Mr. Washington, that was dramatic, but it doesn't change the facts." Denzel didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, gentle, almost merciful. "Madam Speaker, your name is on a congressional travel request for San Francisco, 3 days after the East Palestine derailment. You spoke at a fundraiser that night. Not one word about the disaster. I have the receipts. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. One of her aides buried his face in his hands. Another discreetly slid a file beneath the desk. Senators began tapping on their tablets. Screens lit up with breaking headlines quoting Denzel's words and digging deep into Pelosi's record. And outside, America started asking questions. While Pelosi shrank beneath the crushing weight of silence, something else was happening. Eyes turned to Denzel, not with doubt, but with respect. A few months ago, some had dismissed him as just an actor, just a public figure, just another idealist. But today he wasn't defending himself. He was defending the people that America had forgotten. He stood for every town abandoned by bureaucracy, every mother who felt invisible, every child who watched tap water turn brown while leaders sipped wine behind closed doors. Denzel looked up again. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I don't need a political win today. I need the truth spoken out loud, because the dead can't testify. Someone in the chamber began to cry quietly. Even a few seasoned senators looked visibly shaken. Pelosi looked like someone who had been caught in a storm she thought she could control, but the wind had changed, and now the storm belonged to Denzel. Outside the Capitol, his words spread like wildfire. Newsrooms scrambled. Journalists who had once written him off as symbolic now raced through archives. Footage from Pelosi's California fundraiser emerged. Wine glasses, designer suits, no mention of East Palestine. Back on the Senate floor, an uncomfortable energy hung in the air. Denzel remained seated, his fingers tapped gently on the desk. Not out of nerves, but calculation. He wasn't finished. A folder appeared in front of him. One of his aides, eyes glassy with emotion, slid it toward him wordlessly. Inside was more than proof of Pelosi's absence. There were receipts that showed how emergency funds meant for rail safety were redirected to a climate program tied to a private donor, the same donor who hosted that fundraiser. And just like that, Denzel had in his hands the kind of truth that doesn't just damage reputations, it burns careers to the ground. But he didn't wave it around. He didn't hold it up. Not yet. He simply closed the folder slowly, placed his hands on it, and looked straight ahead, letting the silence do the damage. Pelosi could no longer fake composure. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked. Are you suggesting I misuse Senate funds, Mr. Washington? Denzel looked at her, not with hatred, with disappointment. I'm not suggesting anything, Madam Speaker, he said softly. I'm just wondering how $2.3 million disappeared from a rail safety bill into a nonprofit foundation that lists your brother as a board member. The chamber erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet. Staffers scrambled. A few senators fell back into their chairs, stunned, speechless. Nancy Pelosi froze. A visible shiver ran through her. I had no direct involvement, Pelosi stammered. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He simply replied, calm and composed. Then I'm sure you'll welcome an audit, Madam Speaker, for the families in East Palestine, for the people still drinking bottled water while lobbyists toast champagne. No shouting, no rage, just truth wrapped in grace. And somehow it hit harder than any insult could have. Far from Washington, in a quiet church in rural Ohio, a group of grieving mothers sat huddled together, watching the live session on a mounted screen. Jenny, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s, had lost her 7-year-old son, Max, to toxic chemical exposure only months ago. She had begged for help. She had written letters. She had gotten silence. But now she was watching Denzel Washington, not as a celebrity, not as a government official, but as her voice. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks as he spoke. Another mother whispered through trembling lips, "Someone's finally fighting for us." One by one, the small group stood, hands over their mouths, eyes swollen with emotion. Denzel's words didn't just expose Pelosi, they validated their pain. It felt like Max and all the others who had been forgotten were finally being heard. Back in D.C., Denzel felt his phone buzz. It was a message from Pastor Lee, the local minister in East Palestine. "You made the angels cry today, son. Keep going." He looked down, closed his eyes, and exhaled slowly. because this was no longer about politics. It was about justice. Across the country, the clip went everywhere. From diners in Pennsylvania to nursing homes in Indiana, people were glued to their screens. Denzel's calm but devastating sentence wasn't just trending, it was awakening something. Talk shows debated it. News anchors replayed it. TikTok teens overlaid it with emotional piano music. Even late-night comedy shows, typically quick to mock, simply played the full clip and let the silence speak. But the most important reactions weren't digital. They were real people, fathers in steel-toe boots, widows from Rust Belt towns, coal miners with trembling hands, all watching a man in a suit speak for them, not above them. One trucker posted, "I cried watching Denzel today. Never thought anyone in that building would fight for folks like us." Back in Washington, Denzel didn't see any of it. He was sitting in a dim private office, lights low, breathing steady. A Secret Service agent leaned in. "Sir, the president is calling." Denzel nodded. He knew who it was. He picked up. President Trump's voice came through, low, steady. "Denzel, you just did more with one sentence than some senators have done in 20 years. Denzel didn't gloat. "Sir, it wasn't planned. It just came from what I saw back home." There was a pause, then Trump said, "That's why I picked you. Keep your foot on the gas, but keep it clean. They're going to come hard now. You just exposed a hornet's nest." Click. Denzel sat back, phone in hand. He wasn't afraid, not even now, but he felt the storm coming. Because when you expose rot in Washington, the rot fights back. He looked again at the file on his desk. Misused grants, shell foundations, the names of silent enablers. He wasn't going to defend himself anymore. He was going to clean house. Back on the Senate floor, Pelosi's allies scrambled to respond. A motion was introduced. An emergency review of Denzel Washington's conduct. Pelosi wasn't finished. Even after being humiliated, she still had allies, deep-pocketed ones, and they were furious. Senator Bronson, a decades-long insider, stood to speak. "This body should not tolerate political stunts," he said sharply. "This chamber deserves respect, not finger-pointing based on hearsay." Denzel didn't respond with theatrics. He calmly picked up the folder from his desk and slid it toward the Senate clerk. "Not hearsay," he said. "Evidence." A collective gasp rippled across the chamber. The clerk paused, visibly unsettled. "Do you wish this to be entered into the public record, Mr. Washington?" Denzel looked straight at Pelosi, whose face had gone ghostly white. She looked like she couldn't breathe. "Every word," Denzel said quietly. Then he stood, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "For the mother who buried her son. For the factory worker breathing poison. For every person who trusted this chamber and was abandoned." Cameras zoomed in, reporters sprinted out of the chamber. America wasn't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a reckoning. As the clerk opened the folder, something unexpected slid out. A sealed envelope, stamped in red, "Confidential, source protection required." Senators leaned in. The clerk hesitated, looking at Denzel. He nodded once. "Go ahead." Inside was a sworn, notarized statement. An anonymous but verified former legislative aide described years of backdoor meetings between Pelosi and corporate lobbyists. It included precise dates, internal memos, wire records, and worst of all, details of a private account linked to a climate nonprofit that Pelosi had championed publicly. Every dollar traced, originally meant for clean water grants to forgotten towns, rerouted. The whispering in the chamber stopped. It boiled. Pelosi grabbed the edge of her desk for support. Her face drained of color. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She had entered that chamber to destroy Denzel Washington. But now the nation was watching her fall apart. Denzel didn't smile. He just whispered, "Truth has a voice, Madam Speaker." And it just started speaking. The storm intensified. Backstage, panic erupted. Two of Pelosi's senior aides rushed into a secure room. One, in a frenzy, picked up the phone. "Leak something, anything. Get the heat off her now." Moments later, a breaking news alert lit up every major network. Denzel Washington under ethics review for undisclosed investment. a small, obscure company in Ohio. But within 15 minutes, the report collapsed. The company had dissolved 3 years ago and had already been disclosed twice in public records. Then the Senate Ethics Office issued a rare live statement. There is no active investigation into Mr. Washington. The claims made today are false. And now the country was angry, not at Denzel, at them, at the games, the smears, the desperation. Even members of Pelosi's own party quietly slipped out of the chamber. She was alone. And Denzel? He sat calmly at his desk, hands resting atop his original disclosure file. No words, just proof. As the room churned with chaos, a small folded note was placed into Denzel's hand. His chief of staff whispered, "From your mother." He unfolded it, written in faded blue ink. "I saw you on TV. I remember when they laughed at us in line for food stamps. I remember how you stayed up late, reading by flashlight. I'm crying now, Denzel, because today you didn't just speak for the country, you spoke for me." He pressed the note to his chest. Then he stood again. And this time, the entire Senate chamber turned to him. He spoke quietly. "I didn't come here to win," he said. "I came here to clean out what's been rotting behind these walls for far too long." He reached into his coat and pulled out a photo. A boy in dirty jeans, sitting on a porch, holding a plastic bag with his school lunch inside. That was me, and that's still who I fight for. Even a few hardened reporters choked back tears. Pelosi covered her face. In America, they didn't just watch, they wept. The headlines spread like wildfire. Should Pelosi step down? Independent journalists dug deep, and they found it. Old financial records, shell accounts, offshore transfers tied to Pelosi's climate nonprofit. Even former allies began avoiding her in Capitol hallways. But inside the Senate chamber, something chilling happened. Senator Carmichael, a Democrat from the Midwest, known for being soft-spoken, loyal, and rarely making waves, stood up. He cleared his throat, looked around the room. "I've been here 32 years, he said quietly. "I've seen scandals, I've seen cover-ups, but I've never seen something unravel this fast, or this truthfully." He turned slowly toward Pelosi. "I think it's time you stepped aside." A gasp swept the room. Pelosi's face collapsed, her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The very humiliation she had tried to unleash on Denzel was now devouring her, like wildfire. Denzel remained completely still. No smirk, no gloating, just silence. Because real justice doesn't gloat. It stands tall and lets the truth do the work. But just as it seemed Pelosi's downfall was complete, the story took a dangerous turn. Capitol security burst into the chamber. Whispers turned into screams. A staffer had been caught sneaking into Denzel Washington's private file room. Worse, a flash drive was found plugged into a secure laptop connected to Denzel's personal database. Intent unknown. Suspicion unmistakable. The person arrested? A former assistant from a subcommittee co-chaired by Pelosi herself. The cameras caught everything, and America watched in shock. This wasn't politics anymore. This was a full-scale takedown attempt. Denzel was immediately escorted to a secure room under Secret Service protection. He sat alone, staring at the wall, not afraid, just heavy-hearted. They were willing to go this low, which meant he was right over the target. He closed his eyes, thought of the porch where he used to sit as a child, the bagged school lunch, the long nights reading by flashlight, and he made himself a promise. No matter what, I will finish this. As the nation waited for answers, a new letter reached his hand, slipped in quietly by his chief of staff. From Mrs. Clara Morgan, a widow in Iowa, 84 years old. She had just lost her husband, James, a retired rail worker, to lung cancer linked to chemical exposure from a leak Pelosi once voted to dismiss. The letter, written in shaky blue ink, "He worked that job to feed our boys. He never complained, even when they made him clean those tanks with no mask. And when I saw you stand up for people like him, I cried so hard I couldn't breathe. You weren't just standing up to Pelosi. You were standing up for James." Denzel wiped his eyes. For all his years in Washington, Nothing had moved him like this. He looked up at the window, the sun now low over the Capitol dome. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was a war for the soul of the forgotten, and he would not let them down. The Senate chamber was packed tighter than ever. Cameras flashed, reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Secret Service agents lined the walls. Then he walked in. Denzel Washington, no longer just a commissioner or a leader, but a man carrying the voice of a nation that had been ignored too long. His eyes were steady, his steps slow but strong. In his left hand, Clara Morgan's letter. The chamber fell silent. He didn't walk to his desk. He walked straight to the front podium, reserved only for official national addresses. Senators stiffened. Denzel looked up. "I request unanimous consent to speak." No one objected. He unfolded the letter and began reading. Every word, every tear-soaked sentence from Clara Morgan. And when he finished, he looked up, eyes steady. "I don't care if this costs me everything," he said softly. "If I leave this place knowing I stood up for the people who built this country, I can walk away with my head held high." "I don't care if this costs me my seat," Denzel said, his voice trembling. "Because if I leave this place knowing I fought for the people who built this country, I can walk out with my head high." Some senators bowed their heads, and outside, America wept. Moments after Denzel spoke, something no one expected happened. Senator Rowley, a longtime Pelosi ally and fierce party loyalist, stood slowly. Her voice was quiet, but unshakable. "I can't ignore what we've seen today," she said. "I've voted with Speaker Pelosi for years, but today, I vote for the truth." And with that, she called for a motion. "I propose a formal investigation into the misuse of federal funds connected to Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office." Gasps echoed across the gallery. Pelosi turned pale once again. Her staff scrambled behind her. The chamber broke into chaos until the Senate President pro tempore banged the gavel. "All in favor?" Hands began to rise. One by one, left and right, old and young, some with shaky hands, until more than 2/3 had lifted them. The motion passed. The investigation was real. Denzel didn't move. He didn't gloat. He simply whispered to himself, "For James, for Clara, for all of them." Meanwhile, back in her private quarters, Nancy Pelosi stared at the TV in disbelief. The headlines were relentless. Pelosi under investigation. Washington's system exposed. America rallies behind the forgotten. Her phone rang again and again. Donors, lawyers, former friends, and then her brother. "Liz," he said, you need to stop before you bury yourself." And for the first time in decades, Nancy Pelosi cried, not because she lost power, but because she finally saw what it had cost her to chase it. That one sentence from Denzel Washington hadn't just embarrassed her, it had revealed her. Later that night, she drafted a statement. Quiet, shameful, effective. Effective immediately, "I am stepping down from my duties while this matter is resolved." She hit send, and just like that, the showdown ended. But Denzel's mission, it was just beginning. The Senate chamber slowly emptied. Like a battlefield after the war, staffers whispered in disbelief. Reporters crowded hallways, shoving cameras into stunned faces. But Denzel, he quietly returned to his office, avoiding the noise, avoiding the spotlight. He sat down alone. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. He had done it. He hadn't planned this fight. He hadn't asked for it. But when Pelosi stood up and tried to shame him in front of the nation, something inside him broke loose. Not anger, not ambition, conviction. He pulled out Clara Morgan's letter one more time, folded it gently, and placed it in a frame on his desk. Then he looked out the window, and he didn't feel powerful. He felt responsible. This was no longer about punishing one senator. It was about waking up a system. And for the first time in years, Americans felt like someone was fighting for them. His phone buzzed again. A message from President Trump. "Proud of you. You didn't flinch. You didn't fall. You spoke for the forgotten. You earned their trust. Now use it wisely." Denzel closed his eyes. He hadn't done it for praise, but hearing those words from this president, a man who rarely offered flattery, meant something, because Trump didn't butter people up. He noticed. Moments later, the White House press team issued a national statement. What Denzel Washington did today wasn't politics, it was patriotism. The swamp fights hard, but courage fights harder. And today, America saw the courage we believe in. Across the country, the response was electric. Veterans, single mothers, farmers, nurses, even people who hadn't voted in years. They began sharing clips of Denzel's speech with a single line. He spoke for me. That evening, Denzel returned home. The lights were low. He entered through the side door quietly, the day still weighing heavy on his shoulders. His wife, Usha, met him in the kitchen. Her eyes were glassy. She didn't speak at first. She just held him, then whispered, "You made the country cry today, Denzel, but you made me proud." He walked through the door silently, the day heavy in his bones. Usha met him in the kitchen, her eyes glassy. She didn't say anything at first. She just hugged him, tight. Then in a whisper, "You made the country cry today, Denzel, but you made me proud." He didn't reply. His throat was too tight. She reached behind her and handed him a stack of letters. "These came in while you were gone, handwritten, no email, just people pouring out their hearts." Denzel opened one. It was from a young boy in West Virginia. "Dear Mr. Washington, my dad says we ain't nobody, but after watching you today, I think maybe we are." Denzel choked, not because of politics, because the fight mattered. He looked at Usha. "If I ever lose sight of why I'm here, remind me of this moment." She nodded, tears running silently down her face. Just after sunrise, Denzel stood by the window of his residence, coffee in hand, the Capitol lawn glowing in the quiet. Then a knock. His security detail spoke with rare tension. "Sir, you'll want to come to the door yourself." He opened it slowly and froze. Standing before him was Clara Morgan, the 84-year-old widow whose letter had changed everything. She had traveled all night alone by bus from Iowa. She looked up at him with teary eyes. "I just needed to see the man who spoke for James." Denzel helped her inside, his voice cracking. "You didn't have to come." "I had to," she said, "because you gave my husband dignity, even after he was gone." They sat for hours, no cameras, no press, just stories and tears. When she left, she hugged him with trembling arms. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Don't you ever stop." And Denzel made a silent promise in his heart. No matter how hard they came for him next, he wouldn't. Later that same day, Denzel traveled to East Palestine unannounced. No press, no microphones, just a folding chair in a church gymnasium. Families still lived with bottled water, with sickness, with silence. He listened, quietly, reverently, to every story. Then from the back of the room, a small boy stepped forward. He held a drawing in both hands, shaking nervously. Denzel knelt down in front of him. "What's your name?" "Eli," the boy whispered. "Is that for me?" The boy nodded. It was a crayon sketch of Denzel standing in front of the Capitol. Behind him, kids and elders holding hands. Above them, a banner that read, "You stood for us." Denzel looked up, fighting tears. "Can I keep this?" Eli smiled. "My mom says, you're the first grown-up who really meant it." Denzel hugged him. No words, just silence. Because sometimes the most powerful messages come from the smallest voices. While Denzel walked among real people, Nancy Pelosi sat alone in a quiet Capitol office. She hadn't spoken publicly since her resignation from committee duties, but the pressure was mounting. The leaks were growing. She stepped to the podium, faced the cameras, her voice hollow. "I made decisions I believed were best, but now I understand the quote, not just to my name, but to the people I claim to serve." She paused. "And Denzel Washington, I don't agree with everything he believes, but I know now his heart is with the people." Backstage in East Palestine, Denzel watched it unfold on a monitor. He didn't feel victory, he felt grief. Grief for how long the country had been blind, for how many had been hurt while leaders played games. But something had changed, not because of a headline, because the truth had finally found a voice loud enough to break the silence. It was supposed to be a routine interview. One more sit down after the storm. But when Denzel sat across from a national news anchor, something raw happened. "Mr. Washington," the anchor asked, "you've faced threats, character attacks, sabotage. Why keep going?" Denzel didn't blink. He reached into his jacket, pulled out two things: the drawing from Little Eli, the letter from Clara Morgan. He held them up to the camera. "Because they can't sit in this chair," he said softly. "They don't have lobbyists. They don't have networks, but they have Mikaima." He paused, and I remember being one of them. The anchor was speechless. Viewers across America, they broke into tears. Mothers held their children. Veterans sat silently in recliners. Young kids watched, with hope. It wasn't a speech, it was a pledge, and America felt it. The next morning, Denzel's name trended, not because of scandal, but because of hope. He spoke for us. Thank you. Denzel, the forgotten, no more. His office was flooded, not just with letters, but with old family photos, kids' drawings, folded flags, and water bottles from contaminated homes. Relics of American pain and American pride. A retired coal miner in Kentucky wrote, "I never cried over politics. But watching you fight back for us, I wept. You gave us back our voice." Schools began showing clips of his speech in civics class. Pastors played it in churches. Even former critics, once brutal, called it the most human moment politics had seen in years. But for Denzel, it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a beginning. He returned to the Senate chamber quietly. He didn't expect a welcome. But as he entered, something happened. Senators, staffers, even security guards stood to their feet, one by one. A standing ovation, not for a man, for what he had done. No party lines, just respect. He nodded, humbled, and took his seat, the same seat where Nancy Pelosi had once tried to break him with a single attack. But it was his sentence that had shattered the silence of a forgotten people. "Madam Speaker, where were you when mothers in East Palestine buried their children while you were fundraising in Napa Valley wine cellars?" And that sentence changed a nation. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, like this video to honor every American voice that's been ignored. Comment below with the line or moment that struck you the most. I want to hear your story. And subscribe to Story Time with Green, because we're just getting started with powerful, emotional, and unforgettable moments like this. Let's make sure stories like this are never silenced again.